We're now going to move on to building an application that's going to bring together all of the concepts that we've been working with up until this point. All of the tools we've been using, including GraphQL, Apollo. We're going to see how to manage state with the help of Apollo, manage state with React hooks. We're going to work with Hasura again. We're going to discover more features of Apollo, just tons of stuff, including the new component library that we're going to be using to style our app called Material UI. So this is the final version of the application that we're going to be building. It's kind of a social media application, a social sharing application where users can add songs and they can share them with other users that are using the app, and they can play those songs. And so just to demonstrate, users are going to be able to grab songs from YouTube or SoundCloud, two different music providers, music sources. We can grab a song from either one of these locations. So let me just copy a song from YouTube, copy a link. Our app is going to determine whether it can be played by our in-app player. And once it determines that that's the case, we can hit this add button. And this tool that we're using called React Player, which is not only going to play our songs, but it's also going to grab information from the URL. It's going to enable us, our app is going to enable us to edit the song's details. So you can see here we have the song's thumbnail to show to users, as well as the title and the artist. So sometimes it's not formatted entirely correctly. So we can take the title here and separate it from the artist. We can provide the title, the artist. The thumbnail is already here. And note that if one of these fields wasn't provided and we wanted to add our song, we hit add song, we have some form validation here that tells our user that, hey, you need to fill out this field before you can actually add or create a song. So note what's going to happen when I select add song now that we have this form filled out. When I do so, up at the top of our queue, immediately the song is added and the song can be played by other users. So we just hit this play button here, and right away we can start listening to it. So this is pretty neat. This is available to us with the help of GraphQL subscriptions, which we're going to add to our app, a feature that we really haven't used in our app up until this point. And another thing we can do is we can have a kind of playlist, this queue, what I'm calling a queue of songs. So we can listen to a given song, we can go through it, we can seek to different parts of it, and then note that at the end, I'll head to the end here. When we're just about at the end, and I'm going to let it play out the last few seconds, if we have a queue, if we have some songs saved to our queue, and we can, this is something we can manage on our own, once our song's done playing, it's going to immediately go to the next, to the song here in the queue, which we can go, where we can go to the next song. We can hit this next button and go to the next song in the queue, and we can go back. So we have a lot of control here. You see this delete button, we can remove items in addition to adding them. We have a lot of control. And just for the sake of completeness, we can also add valid SoundCloud links in addition to YouTube links. So we can just grab the URL from SoundCloud and we can paste it in here. Note that our button's disabled. It's going to determine whether that song can be played. Then we can hit add. We can edit all this information. This looks good. And when we hit add, boom, it's added up at the top. We can play it. We can add it to our queue at the very end. All that good stuff. So let's not waste any time building this. The first thing that we're going to build out is just the basic app appearance with the help of Material UI. So we're going to see how to work with this first. It's a very helpful and complex library, but very powerful. As you can see here, it really helps us make really good-looking UIs for our users, very functional too. And we're going to see how to do some important things, including making our app available to users on mobile and desktop sizes. You can see here, originally at the beginning we're at a desktop size. If we make our screen smaller, we see that it's responsive and our players added to the bottom for, say, tablet users. And then we can make it even more convenient, say, for mobile phone users. So let's begin by creating our app. I'm going to head to my terminal. I'm going to cd into my desktop, and again we're going to be using create react app. So we'll say npx create react app, and I'm going to call my application Apollo Music Share. So once our app's been created, we can cd into it, and the first thing that we're going to do, we could switch into it. We could open it up in our code editor, but the first thing that we want to do is bring in Material UI. So let's take a second and just talk about what Material UI is. Material UI is a React library that's based around components. It gives us a bunch of pre-built components that enables us to more easily build our application. It uses behind the scenes what's known as the Material Design System. It's a kind of system of elements that the company Google has created. Just looking at our app, you might think that in many ways it looks familiar to Google websites or applications like YouTube, for example. That's because behind Material UI is the same design system, Material, where there's an entire philosophy for how certain things should behave. For example, buttons and inputs, all of the major components, major parts of a website or app, they should function in a certain way for their users. So Material UI just brings that, all these elements, tools, and philosophy to React. So to get started with Material UI, to start using it in our app, we really just need one dependency, this @Material UI/core dependency. It's going to give us all of the components that we're going to be using. However, we're also going to be using some icons. So if we are at the Material UI documentation, materialui.com, if we take a look at Material Icons, Material Icons section, there's a whole library full of icons, over 1,000 icons that Material includes. And this is made available with the @Material UI/icons dependency. So these are going to be very helpful for indicating to our users what different parts of our app, what different components are for. So let's begin in our terminal and install those two things. We want to install npm i @Material-UI/core to bring in the components, and then @Material UI/icons to bring in the icons library. And once those dependencies have been installed, we can open our folder into our code editor. And we can do the initial step that we've done in previous applications, where we can clear out everything in the source folder that's not the app.js file or the index.js file. So we can get rid of everything else except for those two files, and then we can clean up the two files. We can remove the imports, except for the React import. We can just return a div with some text, and then from index we can get rid of the service worker import and the CSS import. And just to make sure, again, that everything works, we want to run npm start and just see our app component. So great, we see that our app works. And one step I'd highly recommend you take if you're using VS Code to build our app is I'd recommend you install a particular extension. So you can go to the Extensions tab on the left, or you can go to View, Extensions, and you want to search for one called Auto Import. We're going to be using a lot of different components from the Material UI packages, so Auto Import's really going to help us in bringing in all of the different imports, the different tools and variables that we need from these packages, different elements. And what it's going to enable us to do is just type the name of the import and bring in the component that we ask for when we just hit the tab button. So we'll see an example of this in just a second, how you can use it. It's really going to cut down on the code that we write. I should say it's going to cut down on the amount of typing that we have to do. So if you don't have it installed, just hit the install button and you should be good to go. So now we can begin figuring out how we're going to structure our app. So let's take a look at our completed app, and we can break down all the different components that we're going to be using. For our component files, it's going to consist of the following. It's going to consist of a header component up here, up at the top. It's going to be fixed to the top. Underneath, on the left-hand side, we're going to have our area where we can add a song. This is going to be called our add song component. Underneath that is going to be a song list composed of individual song components. Then on the right-hand side, we're going to have our song player here. And within our song player, we're going to have a separate component for the queued song list. So we're going to have a bunch of queued songs right here. So there's going to be about 7 components, but we're only going to create 5 files for them. So we'll make within source another components folder like we've done in the past, and we'll make first header.js, where we can just make a bare bones function component with the name header. We can just return a div or whatever we want for now and make sure to export it, and we can use this as the template for the rest of the ones that we'll be making. So we have header, and then another file will be add song. Then underneath that will be song list. Then song player. And finally, queued song list. So once we have all those, we can head to app. All of these are going to be included within app. And we can take a look at how our auto import's going to function. We'll begin with just a set of fragments. Note that if your auto import doesn't work, it's likely because there's some sort of syntax error. So auto import's not going to work if, for example, I didn't include a set of fragments here if I only had one opening tag. There was an error of some sort. So now we can add our header up at the top, but instead of having to say import header from /components/header, we just have to say header. Now, it's not always going to be in our suggestions as the first thing in the list. We might need to go down, but if you've exported it correctly, if you've exported a component correctly, you should get this suggestion. So you can just type header, you might need to go down, and then on the right hand side of the suggestion you should see auto import from ... Then you can just hit tab and it's going to expand our import for us. So as I mentioned, definitely going to save us a lot of typing here. And we don't have to do it above our component, we can actually do it directly within app. So we can just start typing header as if we already had it, and then hit tab, and then it immediately expands. So header, add song, and underneath that is going to be our song list, and then on the right hand side is going to be our song player. And within song player, we can control or command and click into song player. Within that, we are going to have underneath it the queued song list, which again will auto import. So now we can save all of those files, and yeah, we just see a simple list of all of our components, and they just consist of a div for right now. So let's lay out their general position. We want the header all across the top. We want add song and song list here on the left hand side, and then we want our song player with the queued song list inside of it on the right hand side. So we can structure this with the help of our first Material UI component called a grid. So we can lay out our components very easily by just wrapping each part in a grid where we have control over their size as well as their spacing. So how does this work? Well, every grid consists of a grid container and then some grid items. So let's, within app, import the grid component from Material UI. So let's try our auto import trick. We'll type grid, but we see that it doesn't come up. And sometimes if you don't have any import suggestions but know that you should, you can just manually import the first thing. We can import grid from at Material UI/core, and once we've done that, we can auto import other things. So now we have all of the Material UI components suggested as auto import options. So we want the header to be up at the top, to be fixed at the top, but we want to create a grid container for everything else. So we'll bring in add song, song list, and song player, and to make a grid a container, we just add the prop container. So a lot of these elements come with their own special props. Here in this components area in the documentation, if you find a certain component, you can just select it and you get a bunch of demos, a bunch of examples of how it works. For example, you can see the spacing, different spacing options we might want to use. So we see how it's used, but if you want more in-depth instructions on what props are accepted, you can go to Component API and then search for the appropriate component. So if we search for grid, we see all of these props. We see aligned content, aligned items, children, classes, and these are going to help us out a lot and make styling and working with these components a lot easier. So here we just want the container prop, which we see right here as a Boolean. So to set container to true, all we have to do is just provide container right here. And we can also set the spacing, as we saw, the spacing of all the grid items within it. So let's set spacing to 3. Now we want one grid item to include add song and song list. And to make it an item, we just add the item prop. And we also want song player to be a separate grid item. Now if we save, take a look at what we have, we see it looks a little bit different, but we really want these two components to be on the other side laid out like we have in our final version. So we do that with the help of different breakpoint settings. So if we look back at the example, different examples for grid, we see that we can set these different breakpoints here, where at an extra small size we can determine how many grid spaces we want a given component, a given element to take up. So here, XS is going to be applied to the extra small breakpoint and any size above it. Extra small is going to be equal to 12, so from XS and up, that's going to take up 12 grid sizes. And we can see examples for when XS is set to 6 and 3, etc. Then we can see what it's like for when we have multiple breakpoints set. So our layout's going to change at the defined breakpoint. When we're at an extra small breakpoint, this is going to take up the entire width when XS is set to 12, but it's only going to take up half the width when an SM breakpoint applies. So I don't want to be tedious and go through all of the different options here, but you will understand it a lot better once you start working with it. See these different options in action. So for the first grid item, we want on an extra small and up breakpoint it to be 12. And also for our song player, we want it to take up the entire width at an extra small breakpoint and up. But at a medium breakpoint, so we have XS, SM, MD, and LG breakpoints. You can see exactly what they are in the documentation. But at the MD breakpoint, so when we're at a medium point or higher up, we want this width to only be 7. So it's going to take up about 7/12 of the width, and then for the other grid item, it's going to take up the remaining 5 grid points left out of 12. So now when we save, we see our first grid item takes up 7/12 of the screen. The second one takes up the rest. Then when we get to an excess, where an excess breakpoint applies, when we're underneath a medium breakpoint, they take up the full width of the screen. So now that we've got the basic orientation of our components, let's actually begin styling them. So we're going to begin with our header. So we'll go into our header, and the first style component that we're going to be using, not a structural one, is going to be called the app bar. So here's just a simple example of an app bar, and we just want a title, and to the left of it a logo. So here we're going to bring in app bar. We're going to auto import it, and we're going to set on it position to fixed. Now this is the equivalent of setting style object, setting a rule on it where position is set to the string fixed, but this is just a more convenient version. Again, a helpful prop that we can use. Within that will be a toolbar component. Then on the left-hand side, we're going to have an icon. So if we go to icons library here that we were looking at previously, we can search through exactly which one we want. And when we want to use a particular one, say we want to use this audio track icon, we could just take the name, and that's the component that we need to import from Material UI icons. And again, if the importing doesn't work, we can do so manually from Material UI icons. And we can always hover over it to make sure that we're actually getting a JSX element returned to us. You can see here in the little tooltip that we have. But we're not going to be using audio track. We're in fact going to be using headset, or at least I am. And note something interesting here. When we find a particular icon, there's a number of different options for them. So the default version is this filled option. See this one variant for it. But there's also an outlined version. So we get a different style for it, a slight change to the icon. You can also get a rounded version of it, or a two-tone version of it, etc. So we have all these different options, these very precise options to choose from. I'm going to be using the headset two-tone. And once that's imported, I'll just include that like a regular component. And then underneath that, we're going to have a typography component. Now, typography is how we type text, provide text in Material UI with this nice Roboto font that you can see in the documentation. We can customize this, of course. This is something we can do when we set up our theme, but what's going to be important to us is the ability to change its size. So we can use the prop variant with any one of these options to give us the exact size that we want. So for our text in our header, we'll set variant to H6. And we can set the underlying element type with the help of component. So H6 is a particular size and you can see these different options here, H1 through H6 for our headings, but changing the element itself is done with component. So here we don't want an H6 up in our header, we actually want the element itself to be an H1. And we'll give it the text, Apollo Music Share. So now let's save and see what we have so far. So now we have a much better looking header component. We have our icon and our text to the right. The background color of the app bar is the default primary color. So we can configure what color we want the app bar to be set to with this color prop. Many of the components, Material UI components, have this color prop, and we can set it to any one of these options. So by default it's primary, but if we look at the secondary color that Material UI comes with in its default theme, we see that we have this kind of pinkish color. Now there's a couple of things that we want to change about what we have so far. Number one, we want to customize our theme. We don't want to just be using the default theme. We want to make the app our own. And also we want to separate the text from the icon here. You see that they're bunched up a bit. So how do we customize our styles within our app as compared to just using the style prop? Well, fortunately, Material UI comes with an ability to make a custom hook for each one of our components. That makes it very easy to pass our own custom styles throughout our app, or on a component by component basis. So we just need to import a function called makeStyles. And what makeStyles is going to do is it's going to hold all of the individual styles that we have for each part of our component that we want to apply to a given component's elements. So we call makeStyles, and this accepts an object, and on it we can just set individual properties. So if we wanted to set some styles for our title, we can make a title property with an object, and here we want to maybe add some margin left. So we could set margin left to, say, 8 pixels. And to use this title style, we can use it as a class by setting the returned object from makeStyles. We can make an executable function which will name useStyles. So we can use this just like a hook up at the top of our header component. We can call useStyles and we get back an object which we'll call classes. So now on our typography component, we can still use the class name attribute, and we can set that now to classes dot, since we're returning this big object here, classes dot title. And when that's done, you see we now have a bit of margin added to the left of our text. Now what's even more convenient about makeStyles is we get access to our theme. We can, using makeStyles parameters, get access to theme data to be able to give us some helpful defaults. And then using this arrow function, we can immediately return our object between a set of parentheses. So instead of having to specify a specific number here, we can use a more generic way of applying things like margin or padding. We can use a more standardized way of applying these values by saying theme.spacing. So this is just a tool that enables us to add spacing throughout our app, and we can add a factor of anywhere from 1 to 5. So maybe we want to add a spacing of 2 here. And when we save this, we see that we still have some margin applied here. But now we don't have to be thinking about things like what exact number of margin do I need to apply, how many pixels do I need to apply, and how do I keep it consistent throughout my app. So as a result, useStyles and makeStyles is going to be a very helpful tool around our different components. But now the question is, how do we change the theme of our app? We see we get access to data from our theme, but how do we create a custom theme? Well, we can do so within an individual file. What I would recommend doing within an individual file, and we want to do this directly within source. So we can make a file called theme.js. And just like the ability to make styles with the makeStyles function, we can make a theme by importing create MUI or Material UI theme from Material UI /core/styles. And just like makeStyles, we simply need to call create Material UI theme as a function, pass it an object, and here we can create our palette. This is a specific property we need to create called palette, and on it we can specify the primary color that we want to set our app to. This is what we saw when we set the header, the app bar's color to primary, and we can use our own custom hex code if we wanted to or we could use a built-in color that Material UI makes available to us. So if we go to the documentation, we can see a whole array of colors and the color system that they make available and the different color weights that can be used. And we just need to import them from core/colors. So I'm going to use, for my primary color, I'm going to import teal from Material UI/core/colors. I'll import this as a named import. And I want to make, once I provide teal to primary, we can also provide a secondary color, and for that I'm going to make my secondary color purple. So it's as simple as that. I'd recommend taking a look at all the available options here to make your app, to customize your app exactly as you like. But when we have our palette just how we want it to be, we can get the returned theme from this function and put it in a variable called theme, which will export. Now we want to use it within our index file. And the way that we're going to make our theme available to each one of our components is again using React context. So Material UI gives us the MUI theme provider from Material UI core, and we just have to wrap that around our app, and we want to pass down our theme on this theme prop, and we'll make sure to import that from our theme.js file. So now we can save, and we have the primary color of teal applied to our header. And additionally, if we want our app to be of a darker theme, a darker hue, like we see here in the documentation and in the final version, we have the ability to change our app to a dark variant. And to do that, all we have to add to the palette object is set type to the string dark. And when we do that, we don't see anything different because we need to add one more thing, one more useful component, and that is one called CSS baseline. So we want to add this where we add our theme provider, and it's going to add a lot of useful defaults to our application, and it's going to enable us to actually have a dark theme to our app. So let's go back to index.js, and we will import CSS baseline, and we can include that just above our app component. And now when we hit save, we see our background become dark.